As one Soviet author puts it, cybernetics can be used in molding of a child's character, the inculcation of knowledge and techniques, the amassing of experience, the establishment of social behavior patterns, all functions which can be summarized as control of the growth process of the individual. Students of particular disciplines in the USSR, such as psychologists and social scientists, also support the general cybernetic trend.
Viewing the MKUltra subprojects again through the lens of these new cybernetic models of man and his mind, we find elements of the Macy's conferences woven into the agency's unethical experiments to control human beings throughout the Cold War. Case in point is Subproject 119. Its admitted aim was an interpretive survey of work being done in psychophysiological research and instrumentation, with 5 goals stated simply by order of operations. A. Bioelectric sensors, sources of significant electrical potential and methods of pickup. B. Recording, amplification, electronic tape, and other multi-channel recording. C. Analysis, autocorrelators, spectrum analyzers, etc., and coordination with automatic data processing equipment. D. Standardization of data for correlation with biochemical, physiological, and behavioral indices. And once they had all that figured out, E. Techniques of activation of the human organism by remote electronic means. Time revealed the principal on Subproject 119 was Dr. Saul B. Sells, who moved to Texas Christian University after spending a decade with the Air Force School of Aviation Medicine at Randolph Field and working as a statistician for the government during World War II. Sells specialized in crunching data to extract patterns and insights about behavior. Founding the Institute of Behavior Research at TCU, he tabulated the importance of hundreds of factors and environmental conditions that trigger man's predictive behavior. Along with the Air Force and NASA, Sells spent decades quietly carrying out various research projects for the Office of Naval Research, which even sponsored a symposium at TCU with Sells and fellow MKUltra-funded researcher Muzafer Sharif on the stimulus determinants of behavior in 1961. One of Sells' first projects at TCU in 1959 was to send a proposal to the CIA regarding psychophysiological research to investigate electrical signals from the human brain and other systems, and the development of a more advanced multi-channel electronic analyzer to interpret those signals. The CIA responded to these objectives, which it discussed at some length with Sells before appointing him as a supposedly unwitting participant in charge of MKUltra Subproject 119. The work lasted almost 6 years through 1965 and was funneled through the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, later exposed as a CIA front run by Harold G. Wolff and Lawrence Hinkle out of Cornell Medical Institute, right across the street from the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research on the Upper East Side of Manhattan.
Okay, this is their perception of it, if I could just continue.
No, it wasn't their perception of it either. No, it wasn't.
Dangerous to his being, contrary to any previous consciously expressed intentions and interests, contrary to the good of the individual, and subversive to the goals for which he is consciously working.
I understand all this talk. But the situation was, you see, those things were never done because of wise people on both sides. We not able to do this nor interested in it.
They were, though.
Some of the low-level people were, but the high-level people were not, to tell you the truth.
The bioelectronics directories the CIA commissioned Sells to compile included a detailed Rolodex of invasive neurological research projects at countless institutions, being carried out by countless professionals. And yet the names that come up again and again reveal what a small world it really is. Not to mention multiple scientists who were later exposed as running their own MKUltra subprojects. What did 119 really mean by techniques of activation of the human organism by remote electronic means? Neither the declassified documents nor any of the government hearings throughout the 70s ever followed up on what the real goal of this sub-project was. Dr. Jose Delgado is a good place to start. His name appears at least a dozen times in Saul Cell's bioelectronic directories. The general public is more familiar with Delgado's experiments than nearly any other that has been connected to the CIA's secretive MKUltra objectives.
Here we see the normal, highly aggressive behavior of a healthy bull in a small bull ring.
For the scientists who were attempting to decode the central nervous system, electrical stimulation of the brain became a natural extension of the original experiments with electricity that Galvani, Volta, and others had used to trigger muscle contractions in frogs at the tail end of the 18th century. By the time Dr. Jose Delgado stepped into the ring, he didn't need the customary red cape anymore. Only a remote control.
Neurophysicist Dr. Jose Delgado was financed by the Office of Naval Research.
Delgado had implanted a series of electrodes into the aggression center of a bull's brain. And then he invited the press.
The electrodes are attached to a small transistorized electrical stimulator, which is cemented to the bull's skull. The electrical stimulator in the skull responds to radio stimulation, so the bull is literally subject to remote control.
Delgado has remote control of the animal.
When the remote control apparatus is operated and the bull's caudate nucleus is stimulated, the bull becomes non-aggressive.
Stopping the charging animal now only required the push of a button.
According to Marcuse, inner freedom designates the private space in which man may become and remain himself. Today, this private space has been invaded and whittled down by technological reality.
The techno-matador spectacle, which made headline upon controversial headline in 1966, was meant to shock people, to put humans in their place. But at this point in his career, Dr. Delgado was just showing off his ability to remote control the bull. He had been implanting electrodes in different centers of the brain since the early 1950s. By demonstrating that he could turn a bull on and off like a toy, in what observers could have been forgiven for mistaking as high-tech voodoo, Delgado apparently fancied himself the ultimate matador.
Recently released CIA documents refer to the feasibility of remote control of animals, and that special investigations will be conducted toward the application of selected elements of these techniques to man.
But the good doctor was only one of a network of neurophysiologists and psychiatrists running parallel research programs across the U.S. and the world. Cybernetician Warren McCullough was also among the earliest pioneers of deep electrode stimulation in the 30s at the Yale Laboratory of Neurophysiology, establishing the profound connection between the thalamus buried inside the brain and the outer sensory cortex that Wilder Penfield first explored.
The master control for the whole body resides in the brain, and the new methodology of implanted electrodes has provided direct access to the centers which regulate most of the body's activities.
But by the end of the half-century mark, things were honed into an operable science, and McGill would once again prove to be groundbreaking in decoding the inner brain. While Professor Donald Hebb was busy exploring the mechanisms of neural networks and the effects of isolation upon the mind, in part for the CIA, his postdoctoral students James Olds and Peter Milner were stumbling upon their own findings, which would prove to be pivotal. Although it had been accidental at first, Olds and Milner had discovered the so-called pleasure center of the brain through an extension of the technique Wilder Penfield first developed.
A new window on the brain was opened in 1953, when a rat fortuitously evidenced a neuro-rewarding effect. By returning to the place where he had been when an electrical stimulus was applied to the brain via chronically implanted electrodes.
In terms of conditioned behavior, this electrically induced reward became an end unto itself. In 1954, Olds created a reward map of the brain featuring locations where electrical stimulation caused mammals to come back for more. The reward map held true for rats, cats, monkeys, and humans. By 1961, James Olds, who'd been attending Macy's sister conferences on the central nervous system during the late 50s alongside Frank Fremont Smith, Howard Liddell, and other cybernetics acolytes, made history after he implanted an electrode into the pleasure center of a lab rat's brain and conditioned it to trigger its own self-satisfying electrical stimulation.
This is a device which trains the animal to turn on the stimulus for himself. Here you notice the animal wandering toward the pedal. When he first touches it, he gets no stimulation. It's not connected yet.
By pressing a simple lever.
Then one time he touches the pedal, it does turn on the stimulation. You can see the lights go on.
Within this cybernetic loop of electric stimulus and reward, Olds and Milner's experimental rats quickly succumbed to self-stimulating their own brains repeatedly, thousands of times, foregoing their own natural drives for hunger, sex, and even willingly enduring immense pain.
Now, I will electrify the grid. The animal must cross an area that gives a very painful shock to the feet in order to get to the pedal and stimulate the brain.
Rats implanted with these electrodes continued to push and push and push the lever again and again and again, even until the point of death, just to receive this stimulating electrical reward. Clearly, these researchers had uncovered something with far-reaching implications.
This shows a rat is willing to pay a very high price in order to get to the pedal.
In 1953, this series of therapeutic research experiments was conducted by Dr. Robert Heath of Tulane University. His subjects responded to electrical stimulation of isolated brain centers implanted with electrodes. We see here the possibility for direct physical manipulation of the mind and personality.
Feel good, do you think? Or if you do it too much, does it have any bad effects on you? No bad effects at all.
Most of the scientists who conduct these experiments say that because they do not yet understand enough about the brain, these techniques should not be used on humans. But this man says they should. He is Dr. Robert Heath of Tulane University Medical School in New Orleans.
Famously, he claims to have turned down the CIA when the agency approached him about conducting covert research into the pain and pleasure centers of the brain. Reportedly offended at the abhorrent suggestion, he was quoted in dozens of papers as saying,
"I took the stand that if I wanted to be a spy, I'd be a spy. I wanted to be a doctor and practice medicine."
But in reality, Dr. Robert G. Heath had been investigating the effects of mind-altering surgeries and substances for the government since at least 1943, when as a military psychiatrist and chief resident at the Neurological Institute in New York tied to Columbia University, he performed experimental leucotomies and tested ergotamine tartrate, a precursor to LSD derived from ergot, on war-weary, psychologically stressed merchant marines. Curiously, despite the fact that practically nothing has been mentioned about it since, the press billed the experimental ergot treatment as a miracle cure for shell shock that could permanently relieve symptoms in a mere 2 hours. By 1949, Dr. Heath was made head of Tulane's newly created Neurology and Psychiatry Department, and while the exact relationship remains unclear at this point, what is clear is that sometime during the early days of the CIA and military prodding into mind control through top-secret projects like Bluebird, Artichoke, and Chatter, Dr. Robert Heath was again tapped to go further than ever before in testing LSD, mescaline, and other mind-altering chemicals on his human patients. Dr. Heath carried out his research in the name of battling schizophrenia and mental disorders, which afforded him an endless supply of human test subjects. From the Tulane Medical School where he housed his labs, from the imposing charity hospital across the street, from the remote East Louisiana State Hospital hours away in rural Jackson, and even from the notorious Alcatraz of the South, Angola Prison. Because existing treatments had failed these patients, almost any experimental technique could be justified in their cases, although there is little evidence that Heath's experiments were actually therapeutic. By 1952, Dr. Heath had already outfitted nearly 24 mental patients with semi-permanent electrodes in their brains.
Yeah, I just feel like I don't have any thoughts like a human being. I'm just an animal walking around on the earth. please don't do me like this. Please don't. I can't stand it. I don't like to feel like this.
That's right. That's right. That's right. That's right. Now look at that smile you got now.
Why does that make me do that? I don't like to do that.
You really told me off, remember? Hmm?
I know I did, but I couldn't help it.
In spite of all this, Heath's results were promising, at least to the intelligence community anyway. A 1954 volume published through Harvard Press with funding from the Commonwealth Fund, later revealed as a CIA cutout, included details about Heath's research presented at a symposium which attracted participation from other notables in the field. That same year, Dr. Heath was invited to Edgewood Arsenal, where he was the keynote speaker at an Army Chemical Corps event and discussed the progression of his work with electrical stimulation and recording in the brain of man. Perhaps not so coincidentally, Tulane University reportedly signed off on a facility security clearance for Heath's entire department afterwards.
Other Army experiments continued on mental patients around the country. Work done at the Tulane Medical Center in New Orleans involved several drugs, hallucinogenics, and electrodes implanted in the brain.
FOIA documents would later reveal that Heath also took a CIA contract in 1955 to study the effects of the drug bulvocapnine, allegedly being tested by the Soviets to induce stupor and break willpower. For his test subjects, Heath pulled a couple of otherwise healthy prisoners from Angola. The bulk of Dr. Heath's work and of the resources of Tulane Medical School were not just focused on the testing of drugs, but the altering of human behavior. This took on a decided focus with Dr. Heath's obsession over the septal area, a rather pliable part of the limbic system near the amygdala, where he believed schizophrenics may have had an imbalance, and where he found excitatory pleasure and inhibitory pain could be systematically elicited on an electrode's command.
Now, as a patient in a New Orleans hospital, he has had electrodes implanted deep within his brain for a year and a half. In that time, he has been given a new personality.
Dr. Heath paralleled in the human mind the old concept of the self-stimulating rat, in some cases turning over the control to his electrode-implanted mental patients.
Dr. Heath inserted electrodes in the region of her brain he thought might be associated with pleasure.
Who quickly learned that they could mitigate pain or induce a deep-seated pleasure or even sexual arousal with the push of a button.
Find this button there.
That's number 2 button.
Most pleasurable.
How do you feel? You're trying to tell me how it excites you, is that it?
Oh, I think it's somewhat of a sexy button.
Down long Louisiana roads boiling hot in the summer heat. On the path to remote mental wards and prisons, the ethical dilemmas were beyond blatant. Hospital administrators and wardens proved all too willing to give access for human experimentation that would have been unacceptable not just under the Nuremberg codes, but standard American practice at the time. Dr. Heath also notoriously attempted to convert a homosexual man using brain stimulation to trigger his sexual centers in the presence of a female prostitute. Despite the highly publicized claim that he didn't want to be a spy, Dr. Heath was also attending symposiums on topics such as hallucinations, among many who would later be exposed as MK-Ultra subproject heads, including Dr. Maitland Baldwin of Subproject 62, Dr. Martin Orne of Subproject 84, and Dr. Louis Jolyon West of Subproject 43.
There's no way that I can see that it could be abused or misused. The control is in his hands. But some people fear that the control won't stay in the patient's hands, that electrical stimulation could be used to manipulate people rather than to treat mental illness.
By placing electrodes deep within the brain, investigators, including Dr. Jose Delgado of Yale University, have located precise regions that activate emotions such as fear and rage, and basic drives such as hunger and sex. Electrodes can carry currents into the brain and allow the scientist to control behavior.
By the end of the 50s, the art of brain stimulation had advanced from long, conspicuous wire leads to more discreet remote control technology, and Delgado had virtually mastered an elaborate program of behavior modifications which he demonstrated in his monkeys.
The motor cortex is probably like a large keyboard, able to play the strings of muscular contraction and to produce movements.
In his Yale laboratory, Dr. Delgado has gone even further. By pushing a button, he controls life in a colony of monkeys. He can direct their behavior and change the neatly ordered structure of their society.
Delgado could turn everything from emotions to actions on and off like a light switch. Flipping it on, Delgado could, for example, adjust the diameter of a monkey's pupil as if it were the iris of a camera, constricting one eye and dilating the other with great precision by varying signal strength sent to the hypothalamus. Anger, arousal, fear, or sleep could be dialed up just as easily. He called his device a stimoceiver.
We are used to the idea that machines can be controlled from a distance by means of radio signals. Garage doors can be opened or closed. Channels and volume of a TV set can be adjusted from an armchair. Even orbiting capsules can be directed from tracking stations on Earth. But perhaps it is still surprising to learn that we may also control the biological functions of living organisms from a distance.
Newspapers both repulsed and gripped the public with just how much control a little electricity had upon the brain. Dr. Delgado found his stimocievers could even induce mothers to ignore their young on command. The electrode signals were so compelling and so precise, in fact, that Delgado was able to reliably provoke a single monkey into carrying out a complex series of 12 actions that led to attacking a rival monkey. When a computer-programmed signal was sent to the monkey's stimoceiver, the monkey predictably carried out the same sequence of actions in the exact same order every single time, 20,000 times in a row.
Cats, monkeys, or human beings can be induced to flex a limb, to reject food, or to feel emotional excitement under the influence of electrical impulses reaching the depths of their brains through radio waves purposely sent by an investigator.
Just to make a point, Delgado also turned the controls over to the colony as well, and the normally subservient monkeys were able to push a button and suppress the aggression of the most dominant one, and freely roam around his territory and even mock him to his face, demonstrating that brain stimulation could upend order in the primate world. But of course, Delgado's ambitions weren't ultimately focused just on the primate world.
But when violence strikes, then those in public responsibility have an immediate and a very different job, not to analyze, but to end disorder. $200 million Americans did not strike down Robert Kennedy last night, any more than they struck down President John F. Kennedy in 1963, or Dr. Martin Luther King in April of this year. But those awful events give us ample warning that in a climate of extremism, of contempt for the rights of others, of disrespect for law, violence may bring down the very best among us. A nation that tolerates violence in any form cannot expect to be able to confine it to just minor outbursts. The violence must be stopped quickly, finally, and permanently.
Psychosurgery, is that a reasonable practice?
No.
Even for the most serious of illnesses?
No.
Even after everything else has been tried?
I get the feeling you mean, is it a reasonable therapy?
Yes, that's
No, but it's not a therapy. That's the first thing that needs to be said, is it's an experimental procedure. Now, if we recognize that it's experimental, then we would have to ask all your questions over again and say, is it a reasonable experiment?
Is it a reasonable experiment?
I would say it hasn't been conducted reasonably so far, and I don't see any signs that it's going to be. A reasonable, and I'm using the term reasonable to mean ethical, legal, and above board. That would imply, first of all and foremost, that the subject of the experiment is told that he's being experimented upon, and that isn't done.
Working in conjunction with a team of doctors in Boston, Dr. Delgado experimented on neurological patients to develop a treatment to scientifically disarm violent behavior. Doctors Vernon Mark and Frank Irvin were emerging stars on the psychosurgery scene, with claims that ghetto rioters were just the beginning, that millions could be suffering from some ambiguous, undiagnosed brain disease and turn violent, despite the fact that the brain remained little understood in its complex, interrelated functions.
Each patient wears a stimoceiver, which receives a signal via radio that stimulates electrodes in the brain. Meanwhile, electrical signals of brain activity are sent back by telemetry, while the patient moves freely through the hospital ward.
It can't be missed that this work was the logical progression of the CIA's MKUltra Subproject 94 for the, quote, continuation of investigations on the remote directional control of activities in selected species of animals through miniaturized stimulating electrode implants in specific brain center areas. During this time, Dr. Delgado's work was funded by the Office of Naval Research, which was later exposed as a conduit for covert funding for the CIA's MKUltra projects. Officially, however, the contractor who carried out this research is still unknown to this day. A FOIA request sent to the CIA for any information regarding contract work Delgado may have done for them was returned with a letter that the agency could neither confirm nor deny Dr. Delgado had ever worked for them.
Behaviors such as aggression can be evoked or inhibited.
Just as with primates and other animals, Doctors Delgado, Mark, and Irvin could hijack bodily functions and invoke some rather precise behaviors in their human patients, who, unlike their counterparts in the animal kingdom, could verbally describe what they were feeling and experiencing.
There was a slight euphoria. The patients were definitely changed. Relaxed, enjoying themselves, frequently smiling, some laughing out loud. They wanted more. A female patient reported a pleasant tingling sensation in the left side of her body. Quote, "From my face down to the bottom of my legs," unquote. She started giggling, openly expressed her fondness for the therapist, who was new to her, kissed his hands, and talked about her immense gratitude for what was being done for her. Repetition made the patient more flirtatious, until she openly expressed her desire to marry the therapist. Similar ESB response was generated in an 11-year-old boy who also reported fondness for the therapist, causing the child to state that he wished he was a girl instead of a boy. From about 200 other points, ESB produced unpleasant reactions including anxiety, sadness, depression, fear, and emotional outbursts. A female patient reported feeling threatened, that she thought something horrible was going to happen, a premonition of imminent disaster of unknown cause. Some patients said they just felt as if their minds were blank or as if they had been drinking a lot of beer. Still others were overcome by uncontrollable rage.
Dr. Frank Irvin would later describe how
one could sit with one's hand on the knob and control the level of the patient's anxiety.
Now, can you tell me if there's any change at all?
In one of our patients, stimulation through implanted electrodes evoked a flexion of the right hand. When the patient was warned of the oncoming stimulation and was asked to try to keep his fingers extended, he could not prevent the evoked movement and said, "I guess, doctor, that your electricity is stronger than my will."
Curiously, many human patients, though aware of their treatments, were inclined to try and rationalize their actions when triggered by stimulation as though it were natural behavior.
Electrical stimulation in one of our patients produced head-turning and with a well-oriented sequence, as if the patient were looking for something. This stimulation was repeated 6 times over 2 days. The patient considered the evoked activity spontaneous and always offered a reasonable explanation for it. When asked, "What are you doing?" the answers were, "I'm looking for my slippers. I heard a noise. I am restless. And I was looking under the bed."
Using these electrodes to target specific points within the behavioral centers in the brain, which the doctors claim were contributing to a patient's violent behavior, they would deliver their treatment by destroying these points with microwave radiation in something of a micro-lobotomy, attempting to erase the capacity for these negative emotions altogether. A direct disciple of Dr. Robert Heath, Dr. Frank Irvin was a neurologist and psychiatrist who spent his formative years in the seedy New Orleans atmosphere of experimental brain research, before being appointed head of the Stanley Cobb Psychiatric Laboratories at the elite Massachusetts General Hospital. The methods of deep brain stimulation that Frank Irvin acquired under Heath would now be put to even more controversial use in attempting to eradicate human violence. Irvin's partner and co-author, Dr. Vernon Mark, an associate professor in neurosurgery at Harvard Medical, had been associated with Massachusetts General Hospital since 1949 and spent nearly a decade overseas at the height of the Cold War in a specialized neurological wing at a U.S. Air Force hospital in Germany, before coming home to be named director of neurosurgery at Boston City Hospital. Doctors Mark and Irvin worked in state-of-the-art facilities under the direction of Dr. William Sweet, a Harvard medical professor and chief neurosurgeon at Massachusetts General who, just like Dr. Wilder Penfield, was a Rhodes Scholar and studied under Sherrington at Oxford. Dr. William Sweet, co-inventor of proton emission therapy, had long been experimenting on patients with radiation at Mass General. Some of this work, including injecting 11 terminally ill and comatose patients with uranium, was classified under the auspices of the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission.
The United States government actually did carry out on our citizens experiments involving radiation. While most of the tests were ethical by any standards, some were unethical, not only by today's standards, but by the standards of the time in which they were conducted.
Allegations of patient abuse and disregard for informed consent were later pursued in court, but never quite caught up to the prestigious and highly connected Dr. Sweet. To give you a little idea of the mindset these men brought to the operating table, Dr. Mark pointed out, quote,
"Moral values are social concerns, not medical ones in any presently recognized sense."
And in an interview, Dr. Irvin told Mind Manipulators authors Alan Shefflin and Edward Opton that brain-damaged children and senile elderly people are sometimes, quote, monstrous little organisms, and the kind of violent patients he treated were, to most doctors, a pain in the ass. Dr. Irvin also noted about his work that
we're not talking about being nicer to people. I make no human argument at all. We're really talking about being socially cost-effective.
I did not expect to be a reformer in psychiatry. I did not expect, in particular, to be the first physician to ever come out publicly opposed to lobotomy and psychosurgery and to take a public stand about it. I realized that psychiatry was going in a very bad direction. I went into private practice and I expected to write novels, maybe books about psychology, and to help people being a therapist. I was just sitting there reading newspapers and I opened up a psychiatric newspaper, and in it I found an announcement of the Second International Conference of Psychosurgeons. The first one had occurred decades earlier at the height of psychosurgery. I couldn't believe it. They were meeting in Copenhagen and they were giving an honorary degree of some sort of honorific prize to Walter Freeman, who had lobotomized 5,000 Americans during the Great Wave in North America that really took the brains of about 50,000 people. Never opposed by anybody significantly in the medical field. I sent out requests to every single conference attendee that I could find. I finally got the agenda of the conference. Then I asked them all who else did they know who was doing psychosurgery. I told them I was a young researcher at the Washington School of Psychiatry, where I have my office. What came in freaked me out. I could not believe the stuff these people were sending to me. What I found that most upset me was that at the University of Mississippi in Jackson, a surgeon named O.J. Andy was operating on little children as young as age 3, 4, and 5 for hyperactivity, aggressivity, difficult behavior, without even pretending to have psychiatric diagnoses or serious disorders. These were institutionalized children. O.J. Andy was inserting multiple electrodes into various portions of these children's brains. He was stimulating them, and then he was burning holes in their heads with the electrodes by heating them up. And he was then studying the children who walked around on the ward with wires dangling out of their heads. I called the chairman at the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Mississippi, and he said to me, O.J. Andy? I know O.J. He's down the hall from me. His office is. I said, did you know he was putting electrodes into the brains of little children? He said, oh God, no, I did not know that. It was the only genuine expression of horror I ever got, I believe, from anybody in establishment medicine or psychiatry. They set up a committee at the University of Mississippi to require a scientific protocol for O.J. Andy, and he was the first project I stopped. He never submitted anything there.
After founding the Center to Study Psychiatry and raising awareness about psychosurgery in Congress, renowned author and psychiatrist Dr. Peter Breggin started the project to examine psychiatric technology, bringing national and then international attention to the blatant lack of scientific, political, or ethical critique of the disturbing trend of psychosurgery and electrical brain stimulation.
Mental illness is a myth, a fraud, a bad metaphor, an excuse, a rationalization. It's a religious viewpoint held by psychiatrists which says that human troubles are somehow medical in origin and medical in their solution. Now, just how poverty, unemployment, unhappiness, fights between husbands and wives, beatings of children, anxiety, alienation, just how all these problems relate to medicine and relate to illness is never stated.
I might not have ever even had any kind of a movement get started, but became an international movement because I couldn't get any science writers interested. I couldn't get anybody to cover it. In fact, I called the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease and asked him if I could do an article on psychosurgery, and he said, what are you talking about? Jose Delgado's a dear friend of mine.
In September 1967, following another long, hot summer of urban race riots in major cities across the U.S., Doctors Mark, Irvin, and Sweet wrote a controversial and timely letter to the Journal of the American Medical Association, suggesting that riot leaders could be suffering from brain dysfunction. This would prove to be a turning point.
In 1967, rebellions erupted in the Detroit black community. In a letter to the Journal of the American Medical Association, 3 neurosurgeons, Drs. Sweet, Irvin, and Mark, put forth a theory as to the cause of the violence in Detroit. They said in part, I quote, "There is evidence from several sources recently collected by the Neuro Research Foundation that brain dysfunction related to local lesions plays a significant role in the violent and assaultive behavior of thoroughly studied patients. Their idea was subtle but clear. The reason individuals were violent during rebellions was due to a brain dysfunction which they felt surgery could correct."
Then I found, of course, the JAMA article where they talked about it at length, explaining how ghetto rioters must have abnormal brains because not everybody was rioting. So clearly, people who weren't operating at normal brains, and the few who were leaders. We're talking now about men you could name, like Rap Brown and others. We're talking about some men who were outraged at the conditions of life in which the children were growing up in these ghettos. And these men were, from the perspective of many in the black community, the only hope. They were heroes.
Of those heroes, Dr. Sweet was quoted as saying,
"We're talking about senseless behavior. The proponents of urban disorders seem to be the people who are most likely to suffer from organic brain diseases."
And the idea that a leader must be the crazy one because you don't agree with them ideologically or because you're afraid of them doesn't make any medical sense. But boy, did it make political sense. Wow.
The kind of violence that we're talking about here, social unrest among a population in a repressed community, can only be seen as a kind of brain dysfunction by ignoring the legitimate causes of the behavior. And my reaction to the letter from which you quoted and to the whole idea of trying to deal with social violence as if it was something wrong inside of the people's heads who are violent is a way of refusing to look at the legitimate social causes of a very important and significant kind of behavior.
To the extent that medical science has created this new, in quote, technology, there is the desire to use it, you see, and the most logical population to use it against are poor people, black people, and people who are incarcerated.
The Boston doctors called for an extensive research project to identify the early warning signs of violent behavior and pinpoint, diagnose, and treat people in inner cities with what they termed low violence thresholds before they had actually committed any violent acts. And what do you know, but their JAMA letter just so happened to include specific language taken directly from the good doctor's own proposal for a brand new research project which aimed to do just that.
I found out that William Sweet had actually talked to the New York State legislature trying to get funding, describing how this surgery of stimulating brains and melting holes in the heads of people might be a cure for ghetto violence, because surely the leaders of the violence were abnormal and had abnormal brains that could be fixed with psychosurgery.
The first phase of the Boston Violence Project was officially titled The Medical Epidemiology of Criminals. For it, Doctors Mark Irvin and Sweet had designed a 5-hour-long multi-phase screening process, which included 17 psychiatric and psychometric assessments, 5 hormonal assays, chromosomal, fingerprint, and dermatoglyphic analyses, an EEG, and what they called a cyber-medical evaluation. The doctors suggested these factors could somehow indicate which individuals were more prone to commit violent acts than others, singling them out for preventative neurological treatments before they could pose a danger to society. The project was seemingly the perfect cure to what was then being declared society's greatest illness. Right on cue, a vast, coordinated media campaign was underway to promote it to the public.
Good evening. Violence is making fortresses of portions of our cities and dividing our people into armed camps.
Grievances in the United States are more intense now than they've been at any time since the 1930s.
There's crime, individual resort to force.
Those who commit violence are basically no different from other people. Man from birth has a potential for violence, but the incidence of violence can be controlled and prevented by conscious changes in man's environment.
Mark, Irvin, and Delgado were featured guests on many TV programs. And article after article filled the newspapers about their amazing new work.
Is violence then as American as cherry pie?
I believe that assertion was attributed to Rap Brown, was it not? That violence was as American as cherry pie. As an historian, I would observe that there's a great deal of truth to that, unpleasant as it may be.
Doctors Mark and Irvin declared that brain dysfunction was just as important a factor as poverty, unemployment, and substandard housing in provoking not just urban riots, but social protests, fully politicizing what was defined as violence. In June 1968, it all came to a head. Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated, and during his speech that evening responding to the tragedy,
I am appointing, with the recommendation of the leadership of the Congress, with whom I have talked this evening, a commission of most distinguished Americans to immediately examine this tragic phenomenon.
President Johnson announced the creation of the National Commission on the Causes and Prevention of Violence. Doctors Delgado and Irvin would later turn up as consultants on commission staff reports.
President Johnson created the National Commission on the Causes and Prevention of Violence. Today, a task force of that commission released its first findings, concluding that Americans have become a rather bloody-minded people.
Concludes that Americans always have been a violent people.
Americans have always been a violent people, according to the Commission, so much so in the 1960s that the Commission ranks the United States first among 17 Western countries in total magnitude of strife.
Just 2 weeks later, the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968 was rushed through Congress, creating the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, which would fund hundreds of controversial, coercive, and even downright Orwellian behavior modification projects in the years to come.
Then joined in the Justice Department. At the time, there was a notorious section called LEAA. They joined in the funding in a collaborative effort between the U.S. Justice Department and the National Institute of Mental Health. I mean, this was, for me, eye-popping.
But it labels as unprecedented the scope and magnitude of anti-war protest, campus unrest, and what it called the chilling recent contagion of political murders of national leaders.
Violence in this progress report cannot be eliminated, but can be better controlled, and that, it says, is an urgent imperative.
The medical epidemiology of criminals, however, was simply the screening stage for a larger Boston violence project that Drs. Mark Irvin and Sweet couldn't seem to get approved. It was rejected by Harvard's Institutional Review Board. Massachusetts General's Committee turned it down on both scientific and ethical grounds. And even an ad hoc committee put together outside of MGH unanimously rejected it. It was then the project was forced to move to Boston City Hospital, an institution which the doctors knew would look the other way and ask few questions due to its own issues with corruption and mismanagement at the time. Unable to get approval through above-board channels, Drs. Mark Irvin and Sweet then formed the Neuro Research Foundation, a nonprofit organization based out of Sweet's personal home that existed only to fund the doctor's research. Dr. Delgado sat alongside the other three on the foundation's board of trustees. This new foundation would enable the doctors to essentially handpick their own medical ethics review panel, thus circumventing the standard safeguards for human experimentation. See how that works? With no one else to stand in their way, and a positive report on behalf of the Neuro Research Foundation, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare would finally approve the Boston project, and NIMH and the LEAA would fund it. 2 days after that crime bill was passed that would fund their work, Life magazine featured the psychobiology of violence on its cover, another story lauding the work of Drs. Mark Irvin, Sweet, and Delgado. In it, the public was brought face to face with contrasting photos of monkeys with surgically implanted wires sticking out of their heads having their rage dialed up in Delgado's lab, and 20-year-old Julia S., a young woman prone to emotional outbursts decked out in head bandages frantically slamming herself into a wall under the influence of brain stimulation, just like those monkeys, illustrating that man and animals were little more than biological machines to be controlled and tamed with technology. In fact, in one of Delgado's publications, he didn't mince words when he referred to his experimental animals as mechanical toys under his command. The demure Julia was now the poster child of the hidden rage that could be lurking in any human being, but also of violent tendencies successfully located and cured by remote brain stimulation and psychosurgery. In reality, Mark and Irvin's treatment left Julia permanently brain damaged. At the same time, the New York Times was advertising her as a great success story. with claims that she had 0 uncontrollable rage fits since her second brain operation, was back at home and even singing in a church choir, Dr. Mark was forced to admit to a Boston reporter that Julia was actually in an institution, where she would likely remain for the rest of her life. Despite this glaring inconsistency, one after the other, Dr. Jose Delgado and Drs. Mark and Irvin published books to garner wider public and financial support for their work. Delgado's 1969 book, Physical Control of the Mind, Toward a Psycho-Civilized Society, spells out in graphic, controversial detail exactly what the aim of such technology ultimately is: behavior modification and control at a society-wide level.
The technology for destruction has now placed at the disposal of man a vast arsenal of ingenious weapons which facilitate all forms of violence, including crimes against property, assassinations, riots, and wars, threatening not only individual life and national stability, but the very existence of civilization.
The New York Times promoted Delgado's book with the headline, "What kind of humans would we like to construct?"
Is it feasible to induce a robot-like performance in animals and man by pushing the buttons of a cerebral radio stimulator? Could drives, desires, and thoughts be placed under the artificial command of electronics? Can personality be influenced by ESP? Can the mind be physically controlled?
Meanwhile, headlines in newspapers all across the nation warned Americans that the United States was so overrun with violence. Unless some type of massive, widespread political and social reform was undertaken immediately, America was on track to become a nation of garrison cities where, quote, order is enforced without due process of law and without consent of the governed. The following year, Mark and Irvin published Violence in the Brain. In a spectacular act of self-aggrandizement, the doctors dedicated the book to themselves, writing, "This book is dedicated to the Neuro Research Foundation of Boston, whose goals for the early diagnosis and proper treatment of the violent patient parallel our own." In the book's foreword, Dr. Sweet essentially agreed with Delgado, writing, "Our project holds out the hope that knowledge gained about emotional brain function in violent persons with brain disease can be applied to combat the violence-triggering mechanisms in the brains of the non-diseased. In essence, everybody else."
Violence in the Brain. Vernon Mark, neurosurgeon at Boston City. Frank Irvin, psychiatrist at Harvard. William Sweet, this powerful neurosurgeon during the introduction. And the book is about a man at the time called Thomas R. Thomas was a brilliant engineer with patents who was terribly violent and who, after the surgery, was now completely cured without any symptoms. And the surgery consisted of putting multiple electrodes in his brain, stimulating him, even stimulating him while he walked around the ward, then burning out parts of his brain.
No patient was more highly publicized as a success of Mark and Irvin's new techniques than Thomas R., whose real name was Leonard Kyle, their star patient who, according to their book, was diagnosed as suffering from temporal lobe epilepsy and prone to uncontrollable rages that the doctors were only able to subdue through remote brain stimulation and a bilateral amygdalectomy, which destroyed portions of his brain closely connected to emotional behavior.
Well, I knew this was a lie. I didn't realize how huge it was going to turn out to be. So I began to get a hold of every single thing I could find that they had written. I was able to put together that at the point they wrote in Violence in the Brain that he'd been cured forever, he'd been just discharged from the hospital. It wasn't a follow-up at all.
In fact, Leonard Kyle's story was the backbone of Michael Crichton's novel-turned-Hollywood film The Terminal Man, the inspiration for which came from Crichton's time on the ward in residency as a student of Dr. Vernon Mark. By most accounts, Leonard was described as a mid-30s married father of 6 and a successful self-taught engineer who worked with top defense contractors. including Douglas Aircraft, Polaroid, where he earned several patents under his founder, Edwin Land, who at the time was working with the CIA on the top-secret U-2 spy plane program, Honeywell, and eventually EG&G, one of the most powerful Cold War Black Ops defense contractors in America that no one had heard of, which had spun off from MIT and made important contributions to the development of the nuclear bomb, aerial reconnaissance, and radar. But in their book Violence in the Brain, Doctors Mark and Irvin painted Leonard as an impulsive man with a violent streak who was prone to road rages and spousal and child abuse, a man who would sometimes pick up and slam his pregnant wife and even his children into walls. Although described as typically courteous, quiet, and reserved, Mark and Irvin insinuated temporal lobe disease led to Leonard's sudden violent rages, and the doctors went so far as to describe him as, at times, frankly psychotic, suffering periods of confusion, delusions, and hallucinations. The supposed focus of Leonard's anger and marital disputes centered upon what were depicted as paranoid suspicions his wife was cheating on him with a tenant who was renting a room in their home.
And his wife had been the one to refer him to treatment. And the treatment people had referred him to Mark Irvin and Sweet, who had all this equipment and no patient. And it had gone through the VA. They'd taken him right off the VA wards. There's power, these people.
Leonard's medical records, however, showed no evidence of temporal lobe disease. In fact, outside of mild depression, Leonard's records showed no evidence of paranoid delusions or any psychotic symptomology at all.
The VA records showed him to be entirely normal. His brain waves were normal. He was normal. There's nothing really in the record that shows anything serious. And then they took him and put him in their project.
Here the timeline gets fuzzy. During the spring of 1966, Leonard was officially admitted to the Violence Research Unit, where Mark and Irvin claim they spent months trying many combinations of anti-seizure medication, tranquilizers, and psychic energizers, but to no avail. So Dr. Mark implanted an array of at least 80 electrodes into Leonard's brain. Leonard wrote to his mother and described what was being done to him in Boston as the stuff of science fiction.
During my conversations with Helen Geis, his mother, she brought me a telegram. These are the days of telegram from Vernon Mark. She had written him and said, "I hear my son is undergoing surgery. Can you please tell me about it?" And the telegram said, "Don't worry, your son is undergoing minor surgery." We had it in print.
The doctors outfitted Leonard with one of Dr. Delgado's stimosievers, which sent a steady stream of telemetered EEG data analyzed by computer for an impending violent episode. Then the computer would decide when to remotely stimulate Leonard based on the data. The doctors note that Leonard was a landmark for them. It was the first time they were able to demonstrate that systems in the limbic brain both start and stop attack behavior in man.
Then I found a very obscure article by these men, maybe so obscure they didn't expect anybody would find it, and it said that he'd become psychotic while they were stimulating him. And it described how he was saying, "I don't want this anymore, I don't want this anymore."
Egregious lack of consent aside, now they had a remote trigger for human aggression, a type of activation of a human being by remote electronic means. Just like one of the major goals of the CIA's MKUltra subproject 119.
They would just toy with his brain. They would toy with it while he was walking around, and he didn't know it was turned on, so he didn't even know what was happening to him.
For months, Mark and Irvin remotely stimulated Leonard's brain by computer, meticulously figuring out what each electrode could do. Some made him feel like he was losing control. Others like he was floating on a cloud. It was during this stimulation-induced relaxation that the doctors suggested making destructive lesions in the medial portion of both of Leonard's amygdalas. While under the influence of stimulation, Leonard agreed to the surgery. Even Mark and Irvin admit in their book that after the stimulation wore off, The idea of anyone's making a destructive lesion in his brain enraged him, and it took many weeks of patient explanation before Leonard finally accepted the idea of bilateral lesions.
And then he became peaceful and accepted the treatment after they stimulated him enough. This is key, folks. Passivity, docility, obedience is key to this entire process.
Leonard's wife was also brought in and supposedly threatened to leave him if he didn't consent to the treatment.
Leonard believed that his wife was having an affair. Leonard's wife denied it and sent him to her psychiatrist. Leonard had been in conflict with his wife, but he'd done nothing more serious than one sort of violent event. Not a nice thing. He threw a can at his wife of food and didn't hit her. That was the only fact I could find in the records that remotely resembled violence, and it was reported by his wife.
Despite eventually going through with it, Leonard's wife not only filed for divorce while Leonard was still in the hospital, she eventually remarried to the very tenant Leonard had been worried was having an affair with his wife all along. After a series of lesions were burned into his brain via passing high-frequency microwave currents through his electrodes, Leonard was finally discharged in August 1967 after more than a year in the hospital, a year that would change the course of his life forever.
Now, can you tell me if there's any change at all? Now, can you tell me if there's any change at all? Now, can you tell me if there's any change at all? Now, can you tell me if there's any change at all? Now, can you tell me if there's any change at all? Now, can you tell me if there's any change at all? Now, can you tell me if there's any change? Now, can you tell me if there's any change at all? Now.
One of the big breakthroughs was when I was on the air talking about Thomas R., whom I also saw at one point had also been called Leonard K. Apparently somebody heard me on the radio and called Leonard's mother. And I got a letter from Leonard's mother, and it said, "Now I understand. I knew they turned my son into a vegetable," she used that word, "but now I see what it was, what they were doing to him. He's been horribly destroyed since he came back from Boston. He's had multiple hospitalizations, chronic patient at the VA."
It wasn't until after his treatment in Boston that Leonard committed his first official act of public violence. After moving across the country to live with his mother in Long Beach, Leonard was arrested a few months later for a fight in a nearby town and wound up undergoing the first psychiatric hospitalization of his life at a California VA. Now hallucinating, delusional, and confused, Leonard was admitted to a lockdown psych ward and placed on heavy doses of psychotropic drugs. Less than a year after being released from Mark and Irvin's violence project, the VA declared Leonard 100% disabled.
I flew out to California and I met Leonard. This man who was written up, Violence in the Brain is a Cure Without Side Effects, cured of his violence, who was the star of the story by Crichton called Terminal Man, as sort of the miracles of psychosurgery, except it went awry electronically. This man was on weekend leave at his mother's house. He was lying in bed, and his head was covered with a tent of newspapers. He was in terror. He said, "Doctors from Boston are trying to get my brain." He said, "I'm the most intelligent person in the world. I have an IQ of hundreds, and they're trying to get my brain."
While it is impossible to know what Leonard was really involved in here, it is worth noting that he claimed the experiment he endured specifically involved hooking geniuses up to IBM machines.
It was a post-traumatic brain injury psychosis. Terrorized.
Leonard went from brilliant engineer and gainfully employed husband and father of 6 to a patently deranged, chronically hospitalized, sometimes violent psych ward patient after his treatment in Boston. He never worked again and spent the rest of his life heavily medicated in VA hospitals in both California and Boston. Despite this, Doctors Mark and Irvin continued to write journal articles about their great success story, Thomas R.
And by the way, I would find out that Mark, Irvin, and Sweet knew this. They knew this while they were writing their cure papers. She said he'll wander off and they'll pick him up in an emergency room and he'll say that doctors from Boston have been manipulating my brain and put holes in my head and they wouldn't believe him. They'd call him a paranoid schizophrenic, send him back to the VA.
Leonard was also diagnosed as schizophrenic reaction paranoid type, in large part due to a fantastical story he told with great technical precision about what had been done to his brain in Boston. When he was finally discharged in May 1968, Leonard's records read, "Patients stated that Massachusetts General Hospital were controlling him by creating lesions in his brain tissue by microwave, and that they had placed electrodes in his brain tissue. Stated that they can control him, control his moods, and control his actions. They can turn him up or turn him down. Just like a mechanical toy."
I said, "I want to get his records. But I'm afraid if we ask for them, they'll purge them." I went back to Boston with a letter that I was to obtain a complete copy of Leonard Kyle's records. And I called Boston City Hospital. And they said, "We have no such record. It's in Dr. Mark's private office." Isn't that interesting? I called Dr. Mark's office. And I said, "I'm at a telephone booth with a reporter." I gave him the name. "And if you don't deliver me a copy of those records in 24 hours, we're going to publish it, that you haven't done it." And I'd had awfully good coverage in Boston, and I got the records. In those records, I found things like, "Leonard wants to leave the ward. Progress note by Frank Irvin, take his pants away." I was looking in on the life of a man who'd been as violently abused as any horrendous sexual, emotional, physical abuse. He might as well have been in a brainwashing camp in North Vietnam or North Korea, being tortured. One of the first things that fell out of the records was a handwritten note by him that doctors from the MGH were killing him or taking his brain or something to that effect. It was right in there. In the progress notes, I saw writing on the walls, "Murder." That's all, just writing on the walls, murder. And the VA records did not note that he'd had psychosurgery. But I was able to show that, in fact, Mark had been in communication with the VA.
Meanwhile, as the American public was being sold this treatment as a potential cure for violence,
when you look over other civilizations that were once center stage in the world and now are some of them just footnotes, it wasn't because the barbarians came in and destroyed them. It was because they fell because of their failure internally to do that which had to be done and do it in time.
this track of technologically driven brain research was more than just the next logical step in medicine. Decades of work was converging on the threshold of a vast, far-reaching, covert agenda finally being realized: the activation of man.
Dr. Horace W. Magoon, considered one of the fathers of neuroscience, was also focused on activation in 1948 when he co-discovered the reticular formation in the brainstem, responsible for sending electrical signals and brain waves that activated waking and sleeping states and seemed to hold fundamental sway over consciousness as well, which deeply fascinated cybernetician Warren S. McCullough, who'd known Magoon since their days in Chicago.
At the Illinois Neuropsychiatric Institute, Warren McCullough, Gerhard von Bonin, and a number of young research-oriented neurosurgeons, an high-spirited atmosphere of excitement in the basement lab at the INI was a novel and stimulating experience.
An eager McCullough invited Magoon's closest associate, Donald B. Lindsley, a psychologist and neurophysiologist, to the Macy's cybernetics meetings back in 1949. The following year, Drs. Horace Magoon and Donald B. Lindsley, along with Dr. John French, assembled a powerful team based out of the neurological wing of the Long Beach, California VA hospital.
The Bob Hope Show, transcribed direct from the Veterans Administration Hospital at Long Beach, California.
Curiously, the same one Leonard Kyle would be treated at in the aftermath of his participation in Mark and Irvin's experiment in Boston. By 1950, this Long Beach VA facility had become no mere veterans hospital. Under Magoon, Lindsley, and French, it had become the premier neurophysiological lab of its day, a brain research mecca tied to UCLA's medical center that attracted leading scientists from around the world. By the 1960s, this cutting-edge facility boasted more than 60 patient beds set aside solely for neurological research, with hundreds more for psychiatric and mental patients. And experimentation carried out there on veterans involved deep brain microelectrodes, as well as computers programmed to analyze brainwave frequencies. So it is puzzling at best why, after Leonard Kyle was admitted to the VA in 1968, the staff so quickly and easily dismissed his claims of having had psychosurgery and electrodes in his brain as the paranoid delusions of a schizophrenic. This particular veterans hospital and its brain research lab became the nucleus of UCLA's new Brain Research Institute.
For the first time, man now has the tools to explore the living brain. Tiny wires, electrodes, can be placed inside the brain and hooked up to recording machines, as in this experiment at UCLA's Brain Research Institute. The chimpanzees have been trained to play a game of electrical tic-tac-toe. They are competing against each other. Only the winner gets a reward.
"5 years after MKUltra had officially begun, a special Macy's conference was formed in 1958 to exchange information on the central nervous system and behavior, chaired by Dr. Horace Magoon and facilitated by Macy's Foundation Medical Director and Massachusetts General Neurologist Frank Fremont Smith. The conference editor was one of the most powerful doctors inside Massachusetts General Hospital, Mary A.B. Brazier, an EEG expert and polymath neuroscientist from a well-connected family who had immigrated from Britain at the onset of World War II on a Rockefeller Fellowship to work in Stanley Cobb's specialized department at MGH. The group's participants were steeped in secrecy and had deep ties to clandestine intelligence agencies. Among these were neuroscientists who experimented with the pain and pleasure centers of the brain, alongside CIA and MKUltra contractors, as well as representatives from the DoD's Research and Engineering Branch and the Walter Reed Army Institute for Research. This Macy's Central Nervous System group also hosted a number of distinguished scientists from within the USSR. This series of conferences served as a springboard for the Moscow Colloquium on Higher Nervous Activity, a significant moment at which American scientists contracting with defense agencies worked with, rather than against, the Soviets during what was supposedly the height of the Cold War.
Why is it that everything the other side says is propaganda while we call what we say information?
With backing from the Rockefeller Foundation, the Macy's Foundation, and the National Science Foundation, Mary Brazier and Horace Magoon would lead a small delegation of Americans to Moscow in October of that same year, at a time when such travel was otherwise heavily restricted and rare, to convene with the ideological successors of Pavlov, who were working on the, quote, mechanization of the central nervous system. For years, Stalin had forbid cybernetics in the Soviet sphere, despite its origins in the physiological labs where Pavlov studied his dogs. However, Stalin's conspicuous death in March of 1953, just 1 month before the official start of MKUltra, had opened the door to both Soviet and world cybernetics. Declassified documentation has revealed that indeed, Dr. Mary Brazier had a close relationship with the CIA, and that her liaison was on an intimate first name and even nickname basis with both her and Horace Tid Magoon. Additionally, it was revealed that the CIA had also directly sponsored at least part of the Macy's Central Nervous System meetings. 1958 proved to be a pivotal year, but one more meeting was necessary to set the stage for the activated man. In June, Boston was host to the Sensory Deprivation Symposium, drawing together an elite cadre of cyberneticians, neurologists, and CIA MKUltra contractors to coordinate the next decade of clandestine brain research. The event was jointly sponsored by Harvard Medical School, Boston City Hospital, and the Office of Naval Research. This connection was acknowledged by Donald Hebb, who admitted during the conference that his work on isolation, quietly sponsored by the Defense Research Board of Canada, began with the, quote, problem of brainwashing, but that he and his fellow researchers were not permitted to say so in their first publication. Hebb had been invited by the Macy's and Rockefeller Foundation-funded Dr. Stanley Cobb, who presided over the symposium, and praised Dr. Hebb's, quote, courageous experiments on sensory deprivation, as well as his, quote, ingenious ideas on studying perception in human beings through isolation techniques. Attending this symposium was a familiar cast of characters, including a key unit of cyberneticians, Norbert Wiener, Warren McCullough, W. Gray Walter, and Lawrence Kuby, alongside UCLA Brain Research Institute's Horace Magoon, Donald Lindsley, and Mary Brazier, who is transferring to UCLA's Brain Research Institute, as well as MKUltra contractor Dr. Louis Jolyon West, who is about to lead the UCLA Neuropsychiatric Institute. Also attending was a young Dr. Frank Irvin, who had recently transferred from Tulane working with Dr. Heath to take over the Stanley Cobb Chair of Psychiatry at Massachusetts General. Dr. Cobb marked 1958 as a watershed year for progress in understanding the central nervous system, presenting a radical new picture of activity in the brain based on reverberating circuits, feedback systems, communication theory, and the modulation of sensory perception, all of which became central to the fields of physiology, psychology, information theory, and cybernetics, as well as the aims of the CIA's MKUltra program. This new core of knowledge replaced the classical understanding of the brain. It would now be treated as a biocomputer, to be scanned, screened, decoded, and reprogrammed.
By 1960, the word cybernetics was used by the Soviets to designate this new trend. This new science is considered by some as the key to understanding the human brain and the product of its functioning, psychic activity and personality, to the development of means for controlling it, and to ways for molding the character of the new communist man.
Norbert Wiener had first attempted to tackle what would become his greatest challenge in 1930, when W. Gray Walter asked him for help in interpreting what were considered at that time random EEG readings that doctors and engineers the world over had yet to make any sense of. Later noting a similarity between the oscillating, scanning behavior of a brain and that of a radar dish, both constantly searching for new data inputs, Wiener began to theorize a complicated harmonic analysis of these EEG waveforms. Harmonic analysis accounted for the transmission of information in a whole new way, which eventually connected with the core cybernetic principle of feedback.
And we must get rid of any notion straight away that control is something imposed on the system from outside. It has to be built into it. It's called feedback, and feedback is ubiquitous in control systems.
If one could modify the way the brain processed signals, one could program the brain, the behaving entity, just like the equipment in missile control rooms and just like the experimental animals who'd been conditioned to perform predictable behaviors in the lab. By 1955, Norbert Wiener, who had long ago sworn off work on, quote, weapons of war, despite his continued collaboration with the very military technicians and defense contractors who'd made those weapons, had overseen the completion of a powerful new device, which he created with Massachusetts General's electrical engineer John Barlow and Walter Rosenblith, an Austrian-born engineer who ran MIT's Communication Biophysics Laboratory. Mary Brazier, too, would work on this big project, which would become one of the Cold War's least known but most powerful secret weapons. They called it the autocorrelator.
The apparatus made an enormous clatter. The 24 relays in the rapid repeater, the central processing unit that correlated one waveform with another, chatted incessantly among themselves. The clanking kept up for 20 minutes for each correlation, until the machine spit out its completed correlogram and came to a thumping, self-satisfied halt. Norbert Wiener loved the racket. He was captivated. He was absolutely fixed on the printout as it was coming out. Wiener's goal for the project was nothing less than to find the Rosetta Stone for the script of the brainwaves.
A machine that analyzed brainwaves in analog mode. As authors Conway and Siegelman wrote, the correlator was Wiener's baby, the first analog computer to apply his statistical methods automatically to the analysis of brain function. Wiener considered the machine to be the most significant work of all the things he had ever accomplished. It took Norbert Wiener 25 years to crack the code of EEGs. It was the culmination of cybernetic research that he and Arturo Rosenbluth had begun on automata and feedback more than a decade earlier, leading up to the first Macy's Cybernetics meeting on cerebral inhibition in 1942. In cybernetic terms, EEG represented the first known language, which was not symbolic, but rather communicated directly and powerfully in its expression. The autocorrelator now made it possible to interpret brainwaves intelligently and automatically via computer, and for that computer to send a reciprocal response back through EEG to excite or inhibit brain activity. And when Mary Brazier transferred to UCLA for the opening of Magoon's Brain Research Institute, she brought the autocorrelator with her. Years later, all of this would have grave consequences for Leonard Kyle.
They turned him into a shell of a human being, where the spirit was still there, but it couldn't peep out very well through the tangled wires, the murdered brain cells. He was psychotic, and he was violent when restrained at times. There'd never been anything like that. Never been anything like that.
The Boston Violence Project continued with funding through the NIH and the LEAA. Dr. William Sweet was so powerful and had friends in such high places that in 1971 he was able to directly petition Congress for funds for their violence study, bypassing the ordinary process. The project, unlike your average scientific and medical proposals of the day, was aided by an organized political campaign to garner congressional support run by one of Washington's top lobbyists.
These guys went to Congress. They got a direct science grant from Congress. Congress doesn't give grants for scientific research. They came out with $500,000. They gave it to NIMH, completely bypassed all the review processes of NIH, and said, you give it to Mark, Irvin, and Sweet for their research.
This is how high up the chain this project truly went. All of this despite the fact that brain lesions such as Leonard's were well known for years to cause something called Kluver-Bucy syndrome. In 1939, psychologist and mescaline researcher Heinrich Kluver, a core member of the Macy's cybernetics group, and his colleague neurosurgeon Paul Bucy observed that monkeys who received bilateral temporolimbic lesions fell victim to a multitude of permanent behavioral effects, including everything from docility to psychic blindness, or the inability to appropriately recognize the emotional importance of events, such as the ability to feel fear. The same effects were produced when lesions were burned into the amygdala as well.
So now I found myself looking at what looked like one of the worst, most egregious, involuntary, brutal experiments ever reported in the medical literature, and nobody but me that I could find anywhere seemed to be bothered by it.
One unlikely source of concern came in the form of neurologist Dr. Ernst Rodin, who visited the Boston group after reading Violence in the Brain, hoping to gain information he could apply to a similar experiment he planned to run on violent sex offenders out of the Lafayette Clinic in Detroit. Dr. Rodin came away with a very different picture of what was actually going on in Boston than what was reported in Mark and Irvin's book. The nursing staff informed him that, despite supposedly being a project about the treatment of violent criminals, none of the 35 patients in Mark and Irvin's initial study were violent criminals, or even truly violent people. Dr. Ira Sherwin, the Boston Project's head neurologist, concurred with the nurses and stated that he was not aware of any genuinely successful cases, including Julia S. and Thomas R. Of Violence in the Brain and Mark and Irvin's research, Dr. Rodin concluded, "We have been misled." Maybe now is a good time to mention that, just like Drs. Heath and Delgado, a FOIA request to the CIA regarding any contract work done by Drs. Mark, Irvin, or Sweet for the agency was returned with a statement that the agency could neither confirm nor deny that the men had ever worked for them.
So we have these American surgeons, some of the most famous in the country, getting funding from a combination of NIMH and the Justice. Can you imagine anything more totalitarian than putting psychiatry and justice together?
By 1972, internal LEAA memos show that the agency decided not to renew Mark, Irvin, and Sweet's funding, due to, among other things, the fact that they discovered Dr. Irvin was vacating the Boston Project without informing the LEAA to take up a new position at UCLA, in addition to evidence of the misuse of federal funds, including the fact that Irvin had used grant money to purchase equipment from a firm in which he was the major stockholder. The agency also noted that despite being proposed as the entire point of their research, the present proposal contains no attempt to develop treatment or follow-up procedures for the patients involved. Because, as it should be glaringly obvious by now, that is not what this was ever about.